On May 25, 2025, 32 containers crossed the Iranian border without ever touching a maritime port. This was a direct rejection of oceanic trade. The physical reality of the global map permanently shifted. A heavy freight train dragged those specific containers across 10,400 kilometers of solid land. The steel rails heated up under the intense desert sun. Massive wheels pounded forward. The steel convoy carved deliberate paths across jagged mountain ranges and unforgiving terrain. The cargo successfully crossed the borders of 4 sovereign nations. This grueling overland expedition required exactly 15 days. A standard maritime vessel needs up to 40 days to cover that same distance. That sharp contrast is a numerical strike against traditional logistics. The open ocean is no longer a mandatory transit condition. For decades, the primary weapon against isolated economies was pure economic strangulation. Block the crude oil exports, freeze the bank accounts, and sever the state from global financial markets. This strict containment doctrine succeeded because foreign fleets controlled the maritime choke points. Moving massive physical resources strictly demanded navigation through those monitored waters. Every previous attempt to bypass this rigid oceanic grip collapsed. Then the terrestrial corridor officially opened. Beijing carefully engineered a continuous rail network operating entirely over dry land. The strategic route stretches into vast territories where no naval destroyer can launch a patrol. The cargo easily bypassed traditional maritime choke points completely. 32 steel containers arrived completely intact. The alternative financial system processed the cargo without a single dollar changing hands. This precise operation changes the geometry of international trade. A massive physical freight train just shattered an invisible economic barrier. The financial fence that required decades to assemble now features a permanent breach. The reason behind this aggressive overland transition lies directly in the precise coordinates of the Strait of Malacca. While a land route offers physical security, the ocean forces the second largest economy to rely on a single geographical choke point. The contrast between massive oil volumes and the narrow physical width of this corridor creates a direct mathematical vulnerability. Over 94,000 distinct vessels navigate this passage between Malaysia and Indonesia every single year. For Chinese planners, the stakes are undeniably concentrated. Approximately 80% of all national oil imports funnel directly through this specific maritime gap. Everything runs on energy, and almost all that energy depends on one bottleneck staying open. A temporary disruption in this aquatic corridor translates into immediate financial losses. If the Strait of Malacca closed for just 1 week, direct economic damages would quickly reach $64 million. An extended blockade would systematically starve industrial centers and cripple national fuel reserves. The strategic problem escalated significantly when military realities shifted across the region. Since 2019, the United States has maintained the right to position warships at deepwater naval facilities in Singapore. This exact location sits immediately at the entrance to the narrow strait. A foreign navy could theoretically seal the entire passage within 24 hours, effectively switching off the energy supply of 1 billion people. Engineers cannot simply design a logistical solution around other available oceanic routes. The required throughput capacity simply does not exist anywhere else on the map. Alternative passages like the Lombok and Sunda Straits add thousands of kilometers to the journey. Those backups cannot physically accommodate the sheer traffic volume currently relying on Malacca. The entire national energy grid remains dependent on a singular oceanic coordinate actively monitored by a rival force. How do you bypass a narrow maritime strait that is heavily controlled by a foreign fleet? You abandon the ocean entirely and move the cargo onto solid ground. Pulling global trade onto solid ground required engineers to physically weld together the sprawling steel arteries of 4 entirely separate nations. Building this continuous transport route sounds like a relatively straightforward infrastructural goal on paper. The physical reality proved much harsher. Construction crews dragged heavy industrial equipment across vast open deserts where the sand shifts constantly beneath the fragile surface. Extreme seasonal temperatures routinely crack poured concrete and warp exposed metal, yet this hostile geography was only the first major obstacle. This valuable cargo had to pass through 4 sovereign states, and each nation stringently enforces its own distinct transit regulations and border rules. The most critical failure point was the physical design of the rails, because Central Asian republics operate a significantly broader track width than China. Hitting a new national border traditionally forced a complete logistical halt for every single freight train. Manual laborers had to physically transfer thousands of shipping containers onto completely different train carriages before moving forward. The engineers eliminated this manual bottleneck entirely. Designers brilliantly answered this gauge mismatch by installing specialized automated bogie exchange systems at the most critical border checkpoints. These advanced transit hubs eliminate the costly need to physically lift the heavy freight off the train carriages. Instead, heavy industrial machinery aggressively slams massive new wheel sets directly into place while optical sensors guide the rapid chassis swap. The mechanical clash of steel is deafening. This violent automated mechanics cuts standard border delays from several hours down to just under 30 minutes. The finished continuous railway track stretches for an astonishing 10,400 kilometers across the Eurasian landmass. The transport line pushes aggressively from western China straight across Kazakhstan, piercing directly through Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan before finally reaching Tehran. To grasp that massive distance, picture a direct commercial flight taking off from London and heading straight for Los Angeles. The physical scale is staggering. This unprecedented multinational project demanded a total budget pushing well upward of $2 billion in initial capital funding. Because the surrounding geopolitical environment remains volatile, security concerns dictated the final engineering choices in the most vulnerable regions. Key stretches of the newly built railway inside Iranian territory run deep underground. The engineers drove heavy tunnels directly through solid rock specifically to protect the critical transit line from potential airstrikes. They did not bury these tracks simply to escape the harsh desert climate overhead. Planners built this specific infrastructure to survive a global crisis. By late May 2025, the first direct freight train proved the concept. The massive cargo completely bypassed the oceans. Previously, a commercial freighter had to navigate the Strait of Malacca and cross the wide Indian Ocean. That perilous maritime journey demanded anywhere from 30 to 40 days of transit. This continuous inland rail corridor sliced that exact delivery time strictly in half. The speed of these newly connected tracks reveals only a fraction of the overarching geopolitical strategy. A completely different cargo moves along these lines. They carry an entirely parallel financial system specifically designed to bypass Western banks. The rails physically insulate this trade route from the dominance of the dollar. Washington spent years methodically restricting the Iranian economy through severe financial penalties. Global institutions forcefully cut local banks off from established international settlement networks. Potential oil buyers face serious threats of losing access to American markets. China ignored these warnings. Beijing secured a substantial economic foothold in the region instead. In 2021, Beijing and Tehran finalized a sweeping 25-year economic cooperation agreement. This comprehensive geopolitical contract carried a total value of $400 billion. It established a generation-long commitment encompassing energy resources, advanced technology, and heavy infrastructure. The physical railway network provides the foundation for executing this exact deal. In 2024, China purchased 77% of all Iranian crude oil exports. That single year of dedicated trade generated roughly $29 billion. Total oil revenues reached $67 billion, officially marking a remarkable decade high. These financial transactions completely bypass all traditional Western monitoring networks. Trains roll directly eastward without a single Western institution involved in the chain. Beijing deliberately settles these large-scale energy purchases strictly in yuan. China has been paying for Iranian oil with its own currency since 2012. The trains simply guarantee safe terrestrial delivery. The dollar remains the absolute default currency for global energy trade. Every major deal settled in yuan steadily chips away at that foundational economic pillar. The new railway solidifies this growing isolation from the established global banking system. Russia has pursued a remarkably similar strategy by settling its own energy exports in yuan. The combined trade volume flowing outside dollar systems has expanded sharply since 2022. Geography grants Tehran an enormous strategic advantage extending far beyond its oil reserves. The country sits immediately adjacent to the notoriously narrow Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the global oil supply flows through this tight passage. That geographical coordinate transforms the nation into a natural commercial gateway. Many neighboring states remain totally landlocked. Through these new rail lines, nations like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Afghanistan finally secured direct physical access to open water ports. The established Iranian route provides a strict technical foundation. It seamlessly incorporates Afghanistan and Tajikistan into a wider transportation system. This physical expansion creates the Five Nations Railway Corridor, requiring the construction of roughly 1,300 kilometers of new track. The plans remained largely theoretical when preliminary diplomatic agreements were signed in December 2014. However, the framework eventually shifted into a physical reality when the first test cargo recently ran from Iran directly into northern Afghanistan. During May 2023, a train moved along the Kaf-Herat railway section. It carried exactly 655 tons of specialized equipment. That initial shipment delivered the precise heavy tools required to build the subsequent sections. The expanding infrastructure was essentially constructing itself through a steady progression of targeted steel deliveries across the border. This regional integration depends entirely on a vast financial architecture carefully designed by Beijing. China officially launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. Since then, Beijing has committed more than $1 trillion globally toward major infrastructure projects. Central Asia currently represents one of the most concentrated investment zones within this economic framework. The capital necessary to lay these continuous tracks involves complex credit mechanisms rather than simple cash transfers. Instead, they utilize targeted infrastructure agreements involving direct resource exchanges. These resulting financial structures carefully lock the participating transit nations into heavily structured long-term debt obligations. While engineers lock down debt obligations across arid terrain, a second corridor opens in the extreme north. The Northern Sea Route skirts the Russian coastline. It forms the shortest maritime link connecting Asian manufacturing hubs to European markets. Transit times drop. A standard cargo run via the Suez Canal takes 45 days. This polar passage requires just 30. Solid ice always dictated the operational limits here. Historically, merchant vessels had a tight 88-day navigation window. Now, shifting climate patterns alter the environment. The usable window stretches to between 90 and 100 days annually. In June 2024, Russia and China formalized a joint venture. Their objective is a year-round container shipping line through the high latitudes. Projections suggest the passage could remain ice-free during summers by the end of this century, but for current winter operations, engineers rely on heavy nuclear propulsion. The icebreaker Arctica leads this effort. It displaces 33,000 tons of water. The vessel measures 173 meters from bow to stern. Deep inside the hull, two nuclear reactors generate 175 megawatts of thermal power each. The physical mechanics of icebreaking rely on blunt force and gravity. The reinforced steel prow does not simply cut the frozen surface. The ship drives forward and rides up onto the ice shelf. The 33,000-ton mass presses downward. 3 meters of solid ice shatter under the weight. Slabs of frozen seawater fold outward. The entire deck vibrates as the twin propellers push the hull through the debris. The vessel maintains a steady speed through the fracture zones. The nuclear core provides continuous endurance. Conventional diesel icebreakers require frequent refueling. The Arctica operates for 7 full years on a single uranium load. Its sister ship, the Sibir, adapts to varying depths. It clears both deep oceanic sectors and shallow river estuaries along the Siberian coast. The fleet continually expands. New variations deployed to push merchant convoys into latitudes previously blocked by deep winter freezes. This northern trajectory achieves a specific strategic goal. The Suez Canal processes roughly 12% of global trade. It operates under Egyptian jurisdiction, yet European and American maritime institutions dominate the underlying insurance, banking, and logistical frameworks. A viable Arctic corridor bypasses these established commercial networks entirely. It constructs a direct transport line far from Western maritime influence. While nuclear icebreakers carve new paths far from established maritime influence, neither 10,000 kilometers of new Asian tracks nor the frozen northern corridors negate the sheer physical reality of the ocean. A single very large crude carrier holds 2 million barrels of oil inside one continuous steel hull. A terrestrial railway cannot physically match this massive volume in a single transit operation. 2 million barrels of crude oil weigh roughly 300,000 metric tons. To transport that exact same petroleum payload over land, freight dispatchers would need to assemble and sequence at least 300 standard high-capacity tank cars. A standard maritime vessel stretching over 330 meters in length moves that entire fluid cargo across the open water without encountering a single physical border checkpoint. In sharp contrast, continental rail corridors cross multiple sovereign territories along their prolonged journey. Every national boundary introduces administrative friction, mandatory customs inspections, and technical delays regarding different railway track gauges. The physical environment also heavily degrades the terrestrial infrastructure. Summer temperatures across the Middle Eastern and Central Asian deserts routinely push the exposed steel rails past 50 degrees Celsius, increasing the risk of thermal expansion and track buckling. Fine-blowing silica sand steadily infiltrates the mechanical switching gears and clogs the heavy diesel locomotive filtration units. Furthermore, static terrestrial infrastructure remains inherently exposed to direct kinetic action. A sprawling rail network is permanently pinned to the geographic terrain. You cannot maneuver a mountain tunnel to avoid an incoming projectile or suddenly relocate a concrete railway bridge during an escalating military conflict. 19 days after the logistics operators launched the very first direct freight service on the new Continental Line, the reality of this static exposure materialized. Israel executed a coordinated strike targeting specific Iranian industrial and energy infrastructure locations. The physical impact immediately fractured the surrounding logistical chains and damaged essential supporting facilities. The transit flow stopped. Dispatch centers recorded zero subsequent public freight movements along that specific international corridor in the immediate aftermath of the event. The heavy steel tracks simply sat empty under the desert sun. The rails remained quiet. However, calculating the value of this land network strictly against the massive volumes of ocean freight misses the core strategic objective entirely. The terrestrial rails were never designed to fully replace traditional maritime shipping routes. A 300,000-ton supertanker navigating deep waters will always remain the most mathematically efficient method to move liquid energy across the planet. The railway simply introduces a permanent physical alternative to a unipolar logistical map. Global maritime trade moves approximately 11 billion tons of physical cargo every single year, and the new transcontinental land routes will only ever carry a small fraction of that colossal global load. But when a secure continental route actually exists, the fundamental mathematics of a naval embargo begin to shift. If a nation can secure even 20% of its critical energy supply through protected inland pipes and railway corridors, a military chokehold at the Strait of Malacca or the Strait of Hormuz loses its decisive leverage. When landlocked Central Asian nations gain direct rail connections to neighboring industrial markets, they bypass traditional sea transit hubs entirely. They conduct large-scale transactions outside established financial centers and trade directly across their own contiguous borders. The strategic objective is never the complete replacement of the ocean shipping fleets. The mere presence of a functioning alternative naturally reduces the effectiveness of any future maritime blockade. Yet 10,400 kilometers of new rails across Central Asia cannot erase geography. Nuclear icebreakers routinely fracture the frozen Arctic route. Nations pour billions of dollars into developing these terrestrial corridors. But marine logistics firmly hold their ground today. Commercial fleets still transport 80% of global trade volume. Despite heavy engineering investments, saltwater oceans remain the primary transport arteries of the planet.